We are moving now to the second session of our conference today, Social Reproduction in Crisis, Socio-Spatial Articulations and Strategies. My name is Gabriella Alberti. I'm Associate Professor in Work and Employment Relations and co-founder of the Leeds Migration Research Network at the University of Leeds. It's a pleasure to be here today chairing this session. We have again 4 speakers: Mark Bergfeld, Jana Fingarova, Miriam Nessler, and Vessela Kovacheva. I will just introduce the title of the paper, and then I will keep my eye on the watch. So if the speakers agree, I will let you know 3 minutes before the end that your time is over. And then, as we did before, I will invite whoever wants to raise their hands and make a contribution or ask questions, and then we will go back to all the panelists. So yeah, we are moving to the field of social articulation and strategies, and perhaps going more into the debate on social reproduction, which is one I'm very, very interested in relation to migration. And starting with Mark Bergfeld, who will talk about state fixes and migrant responses to the crisis of social reproduction. Mark, the floor is yours. Thank you. Good to see you.
Good to see you, Gabriella, and good to see some familiar faces at the conference today. So I'll be speaking about state fixes and migrants to the crisis of social reproduction. Given the time constraints, I'm mostly going to concentrate on the first, on the state fixes, and trying to explain what I really am trying to do. So just to give you a bit of an introduction, I think the whole discussion on social reproduction is really important for a number of years now, given the republication of Lise Vogel's Marxism and the oppression of women. And in the new foreword, David McNally and Sue Ferguson actually allude to migration, but never expand on how, migration fits into it. And then following that, we've seen Pluto Press, Titi Bhattacharya and et al. Published another volume on social reproduction. And again, I was a bit dismayed by the fact that they continuously refer to migration, but actually it also remains under-illuminated or under-researched in that respect. And I haven't read the second volume of that Pluto Press, but from what I gather, I think they're trying to address migration. And then the second element of it really comes together through some of the empirical research I did as part of my PhD with different migrant worker activist groups, where I expected to find somewhat of a migrant worker vanguard, and was kind of disappointed by the fact that I found like fragmented bricolage of different forms of activism, which didn't necessarily correspond to my ideological predispositions, but is the empirical reality of where we're at in a sense. And I bring in my own experiences, both of having seen my grandmother be in a care home and visiting her and dealing with that situation for a number of years now, as well as my trade union, my daily trade union work of representing care workers vis-a-vis different multinational companies, intermediaries, dealing with policy work and organizing home care workers. So I'll jump right in. So my starting point for this presentation is really to understand, okay, what does the mainstream literature say are some of the key dimensions of the crisis of long-term care? And I think that by looking at those and using a social reproduction lens, we actually expand our view of how the crisis of social reproduction manifests itself. So if we look at lack of investment, I think, I could use various references there, but I've just chosen to use Emma Dowling's recent book, which I'll come back to later. she uses it as one of the main problems with the care crisis. And what we see if we use the social reproduction lens, we actually see that the use of volunteers really becomes one way to fix the lack of investment within the care system. We see that families can pick up the slack, and we see in particular as well the non-profit sector or non-profit care sector. So that's Caritas, Eurodiaconia, various cooperatives start to move into that space. But we also see, and there I think it's important for us when we're discussing social reproduction to continuously understand the link between production and reproduction, that we also see private for-profit seeking companies being able to move into that space and make use of the same kind of mechanisms. So make use of families' time to care for their loved one, make use of volunteers, make use of non-profit structures in order to deal with the care crisis. The second aspect that you continuously see in the mainstream literature, and in particularly is a huge policy concern, is the aging workforce. So you see in Germany that there's estimates that the average care worker is something like 53, 54. And the issue that lawmakers and policymakers and the mainstream literature really draw out is that these workers in the care sector are more prone to musculoskeletal diseases. So where you see that very clearly, these are often workers who have already worked either in factories or have done physical labor throughout their entire lives, and now have to lift and carry older persons, and it is regarded as a huge as an issue. You also see, due to the fact that there's an aging workforce, you see more sick days and more injuries on the job, which also contribute to an acceleration of the crisis of social reproduction, because it doesn't only mean that these workers are not able to perform their job, but also in old age will require, will have more complex care needs, as well as will have more difficult aging processes. Another element concerning the aging workforce is what we see is kind of a privatized solution, or that puts the responsibility on aging onto the workforce themselves, which is namely the whole wellness agenda. And I think that everyone is familiar with, we have our pedometers on our mobile phones, or we have our mindfulness apps and all of that. And I think one of the ways in which the system is currently trying to deal with an aging workforce, not only in the care sector, but as a whole, is to put the responsibility onto the workforce themselves and say, hey, wellness is the solution to that. And ultimately and consequentially for our discussion on migration, which I will come back to later, it's the question recruitment of young, flexible workforce from Southeast Europe, Central Eastern Europe, Southern Europe to come in to work in Northern and Western Europe. And I think it's only when you look at these mainstream kind of factors and use a social reproduction lens that you see the connection between an aging workforce and migration, because otherwise the whole discussion just turns about like workforce management and becomes a very managerial discussion rather than looking at these ways. So I know we're a bit constrained for time, so I can't go into all of these. But if we want to go into them on the go later into them on the discussion, we can do that. I think one important one for the kind of strategies of resistance or organizing debate are the low levels of collective bargaining coverage. This kind of traditional industrial relations topic really exemplifies the link between production and reproduction in the long-term care sector, insofar as we see that a non-institutionalization or a deinstitutionalization taking place within the long-term care sector. So what we see is that the traditional kind of models of collective bargaining do not apply in many cases in the long-term care sector. So in the country, even in the countries where we have sectoral collective bargaining, often there isn't sectoral collective bargaining in the long-term care sector. Where it is trying to be established, employers are often, as in Germany, employers are refusing to do so. And so what we see is a rise of non-institutional forms of representation, both on behalf of employers as well as on behalf of workers. And in particular, given the gendered and racialized and migrantized nature of the workforce, these forms of non-institutional representation also are structured along the lines. And another emergence, given the care relationship between care user and care worker, is the rise of older person groups, which kind of mediate or are a mediating factor in the employment relationship. So in terms of moving over to the question of fixes and what Emma Dowling does in her recent books, and it really took me back, and I thought, hey, this is a really creative starting point for a discussion, is to make the distinction between fixes and solutions to the care crisis that we're currently witnessing. Because a lot of the different policies that are on the table, whether they're of more progressive color or whether they're more conservative color, effectively amount to fixes rather than sustainable and equitable solutions for the workforce and for those in need of care. And in doing so, Emma Dowling draws upon David Harvey's Globalization and the Spatial Fix, and also on Beverly Silver's Forces of Labor, in which both authors talk about the way, so David Harvey talks about the way in which new accumulation regimes effectively, if an accumulation regime has exhausted itself, it will move into other areas. And Beverly Silver goes a step further in actually showing that capitalism develops, on the one hand, capital product fixes. So it introduces new products as part of its business cycles in order to deal with a particular crisis. And in turn, those new capital product fixes ultimately also result in new forms of labor unrest. And in the same way, she also has a differentiation between with spatial fixes. So once, for example, if you take a garment factory, given you in Bangladesh, if workers organize and raise the price of labor, then the garment factory will move to Vietnam or elsewhere. So what we see from those fixes is effectively that they allow capital to find solutions or find fixes to some of the problems that it encounters, but as well as it always concomitantly or concurrently, new forms of worker resistance start to emerge. What Dowling doesn't do in terms of the care crisis, she doesn't make the distinction between different fixes. So I think that's where my contribution comes in. And she also doesn't look at what forms of labor unrest and worker responses follow these spatial and capital product fixes. So
3 minutes left, Mark.
3 minutes left. Yeah, that's good. That's good. So in terms of capital product fixes in the care sector, one we see is the rise of telemedicine. So you can, for example, see, and there's a concrete link to migration and to there as well, because you effectively can use, a Romanian doctor who speaks German based in Bucharest to consult an old person via an application in Germany. Personalized care budgets are another capital product fixes because it externalizes the responsibility of paying for care onto an individual care user. And lastly, also home care solutions. So rather than having to invest into a large nursing home facility, which is capital intensive, you effectively have home care solutions, which are less cost intensive, but only involve 80 to 90% labor costs. Spatial fixes, we're very well aware of east to west migration of care workers, south to north migration of care workers, but there's also active aging in Central and Eastern Europe or Southern Europe. Just imagine all the British people living in Southern Spain, or Germans in the 1990s, moving to Hungary for their old age. So these spatial fixes continue to exist. So state fixes, how does the state try to fix these? And again, I think it only with a social reproduction lens can you try to make those different links. That the whole policy discussion is currently focusing on care in the community, so trying to leave people in the community. And I think that this also means that more and more workers will work individualized. And so what we will see within the care sector is a migrantization of labor, in which generally you see these mostly migrant women performing these jobs even more so than previously. That being the case, we see a focus on person-centered care on behalf of governments and states, which mean that the person being cared for is the most needs to have all of their demands and wishes more or less fulfilled, and needs to have agency over the care process, which ultimately ultimately results in a stricter kind of labor process, and often is non-negotiable between worker and care user. We have seen in the crisis the use of the label essential workers, which effectively, as I have also described with Sarah Faris in our article from 2020, in which the label is also a way to lock workers, in particular migrantized and racialized workers, into a particular sector of the workforce. And lastly, we see, instead of to counter the kind of informalization or non-institutionalization of labor relations, we see minimum wage regulation being introduced, which often does not cover migrant workers or self-employed workers that work in these specific issues. And then lastly, we see in the last couple of weeks, we have seen mandatory vaccinations being used. And this reveals one of the main issues is that those from outside of the EU that don't have access to vaccination programs will be excluded from the labor market. Those that work, those come from inside Central and Eastern Europe will need to show their vaccination in order to cross borders, in order to accept employment, etc. And by no means am I an anti-vaxxer, but I do think that the numbers speak for themselves. If you see that in the UK, it is estimated that 76,000 care workers will leave the occupation due to mandatory vaccination, that this is not a solution to the labor shortage, but will exacerbate the care crisis. So lastly,
we can really conclude.
Yeah, okay, I'll do that. So what we see on behalf of in terms of migrant responses to these problems that I set out in the presentation is that we see there's a continuous drive by solidarity movements and charitable organizations to integrate refugees and asylum seekers and migrants into the care sector. So this is one way to integrate them. So that this is a huge tension The second aspect is that migrant workers are practicing mutual aid, launching Facebook groups. Even Ukrainians in the Czech Republic, Be Like Nina, for example, is one initiative, but also Spanish migrant workers. Gabriella has written about labor mobility power, so I'll leave that up to her to talk about that in more detail. And you see self-organization based around common culture, language, political culture, and all along the migration chain. So here are my concluding thoughts. I think I've summarized them previously throughout my short talk. I think rather than finding labor unrest as Silver would predict, or perhaps, state, we see that state fixes actually displace unrest onto the terrain of social reproduction, so that more and more kind of privatized private solutions or fixes predominate rather than actually witnessing new forms of struggle. So thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Mark. That was excellent, really thought-provoking work. So let's move on to our second speaker, Jana Fingarova, who is going to discuss Bulgarian mobile families between subordination and empowerment. Jana, please start your presentation as you feel.
Thank you very much. Yes, I will share my screen now. Just a minute to find the right window.
We can see it all right, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm at present, I will present my doctoral work, which was published in 2019. I see some of my findings are very relevant today. Thank you very much for the invitation. Now I'm working for a migrant organization, which is under the roof of Paritätischen in Germany, in Frankfurt. And I'm currently responsible for few projects on empowerment, migrant women empowerment, as well women from mainly from Eastern Europe. So I'm not in the academia. I will talk about Bulgarian transnational migration in relation to their social protection strategies, and I'll try to present briefly some of the findings of my doctoral thesis. It was a big project, transnational project with 4 country pairs. So if you look at the big comparative perspective, so you need to go to Transwell and see other publications. I'll focus on the Bulgarian transnational families between Germany and Bulgaria. And my research question was how migrants and their families organize their social, formal and informal protection transnationally in relation to family benefits, healthcare, unemployment and retirement. Trying to identify how the complexity of European and national legislation reflect on this everyday life of migrants. It was a difficult task. Try to identify patterns of migrant agency and how migrant social formations and transnational ties empower, subordinate migrant families. So why this research? We are here gathered, and we know why, but still there were this ongoing public debate in Germany towards welfare state closure, about these tax-based benefits for EU immigrants, especially the big debate about cutting on child benefits for children whose parents live in Germany, but children live, it's in this case, in Bulgaria or Romania or anywhere in Europe. And it was also clearly stated in the media, from now on, incoming EU citizens must in principle support themselves financially. So it's like this social question is left on the sole responsibility of a migrant. Portability of social security rights, it is the regime which is seen as one of the most favorable ones within the European Europe. It means that if you have worked in Bulgaria, you can transfer you don't lose your social security, you don't lose your years for pension. You can claim pension, for example, from 2 countries. But in the practice, it is not that easy. And there is a big deal of, there is a big gap between old member states and new member states, and the old member states, of course, have their interests. So the new member states have no possibility actually to claim that these EU regulations are really applied as they should. Bulgarian migration is has highly increased since the EU membership, but still it is like invisible. A colleague of mine, Marina Liakova, she's also doing research, but in German language mainly. She called them the unseen third parties, because they just go hidden in the whole migration discussion. And so my methodological approach is a mixture actually of approaches, but I won't stop here because I'll not have the time to do it. Mainly I did interpretive policy analysis with policy experts, experts that were in government, both in Bulgaria and in Germany, in the work agency, Kindergeldkasse, etc. So policymakers generally. And then with grounded theory method, I did semi-structured migrant interviews taken both in Bulgaria and in Germany. I'm also a member of civil organizations here in Germany, migrant organizations as well. So, I tried, this is my analytical model, I tried to see at the Bulgarian and the German national context and the supranational context, and to look at the structure, legal status, labor market, these social security systems, and to look how migrants navigate through these labyrinth of regulations and how they claim their social rights. I jumped to the research findings in the healthcare. It was I found out big problems with this European Social Security, European Health Insurance Card. There's a big mismatch between Bulgarian health system. And generally, for example, Bulgarians who do not contribute to the Bulgarian system are actually in breach of the law. So they need to take these portable documents, E104, this is according to the European regulations, to take it to Bulgaria and to say that they are insured, and then for 3 months they are not in breach of the law. But in those 3 months, they use the Bulgarian health system, although they don't contribute to it. So many of those examples, at the end, people decide to pay both in Germany and in Bulgaria, which is also not according to the regulations. They decide to pay in both countries in order to have their options when they come, when they go to use the healthcare system. Generally, they don't know that they can pay privately in Bulgarian and they can reimburse their social security rights. So there's lack of information about this. This is only a small example of my findings here in the healthcare system, but I jump to the unemployment benefits. It's also the portability is highly conditional and discretional. You cannot export your unemployment benefit in EU. It is reduced to 3 months, maybe up to 6 months if the street level clerk decides on your case. So you lose money if you tried to move from Germany, for example, to Bulgaria and look for a job there. Also, there's a big misinformation, misunderstanding on street level in Bulgaria. The systems are not optimized, and there's a big confusion as to how to do this. Also, you have only 7 days if you go from Bulgaria to Germany or vice versa. You have only 7 days to register at the unemployment benefit department. So if you don't do it in these 7 days, you just lose partly your unemployment benefit. Claiming pensions, this is something that works better, but it is because Germany and Bulgaria have historically collaboration between the social security systems in relations to pensions. Still, there's also mismatch because in Bulgaria you can retire early, and in Germany later, like with 63 in Bulgaria, and 67 in Germany. So maybe these are not yet the numbers because they change every year, but still, and generally people don't know how to do it. Now I'm working with migrants who don't speak German. They've worked here the last 10 years as cleaners, for example. They want to claim their pension. Without help of non-governmental organizations, it is a very difficult job, like almost impossible to do. Then child benefit, the barriers there as too long waiting periods. We have people that wait more than 2 years to find solution for their child benefit problem. So if you're a family if the families are separated, if the families are highly mobile, like circular or seasonal, they just end up non-claiming child benefit. And
3 minutes left.
Okay, and then I'll go to the things that there is this subordination type, but it's an ideal type, an empowerment type, and this gradually learned assertiveness type of strategies that migrants use to arrange their social protection formally or informally. And what I found out is that people that we put in this ideal type of subordination, they have temporary mobility projects, their strategies are ad hoc, they are not planned, they don't have social networks to support them, and they also have pride, shame, and humiliation to apply, for example, for tax-based benefits. They are relative passive towards claiming social security rights. German language is perceived as barrier, but it doesn't mean that they are subordinated like people or families. They just have different perspective. Mostly they go back to Bulgaria, or they just invest in something else and not in formal social security. This gradually learned assertiveness type, I just wanted to mention that it is good that we take the process of time. So it is not like we take a moment picture from migrants and their families and their transnational lives, but it is subject to change. I'll go back to some of my conclusions. That I already mentioned, but some of the possibilities for empowerment I've seen through the European Court of Justice, decisions that are favorable to mobile individuals. However, the European Union has weak institutional enforcement capacities and must rely on national instruments to implement its policies. And that the European portability regime is restricted in its implementation. So it's very great vagueness of these regulations, lack of deadlines to respond with decision, restrained internal communication among institutions, and also public and political debates that shape institutional practices and thus migrants' social protection. So I'll stop on this place. Thank you very much for your attention. I will forward to the questions.
Thank you, Jana. Very, very rich presentation. Very interesting framework as well. Thank you. So should we move on to the third speaker, and then we'll collect all the questions at the end. We have Miriam now, Miriam Nessler, moving to the housing area of social reproduction. So overcrowding in Magdeburg, urban and housing regimes. Please, Miriam, go ahead with your presentation.
Yes. Wait, can you see my presentation already?
Not yet.
Let's see.
Yes, now we can. Thank you.
Right now, okay. Yeah, welcome. And thanks for having me here. It's actually my first academic presentation, so I'm a bit excited. My name is Miriam. I have a background in cultural anthropology and urban studies, and I recently started working at the ILS Research Institute for Urban and Regional Development in Dortmund. But my presentation is based on research I conducted last winter for my master thesis at Bauhaus University. Yeah, and I want to talk about housing, especially about very crowded living conditions of EU migrants today, and thus show how space and social spatial situations are not only articulations of social reproduction, but actually also contribute to and amplify the reproduction of inequalities and exclusions. I entered the topic from a spatial justice perspective with the observation that the question of living space, the distribution of living space and its ecological and social implications are marginally a topic in academia and the rest of society as well. And when looking on the phenomenon of overcrowding, the relation to migration is actually obvious. Thinking of immigration to cities in times of industrialization, thinking of guest workers in the post-war area, and today migrants from the EU, still there's in housing and urban studies a certain color blindness. Overcrowding was mainly explained by little financial means, and only in recent years structural racial discrimination gained more and more attention, but it still misses quantitative and qualitative data in order to grasp the phenomenon of overcrowding and the unequal distribution of space. And also within migration studies, I mean, overcrowding is present, especially in those studies related to EU migration, but they were never in the focus of the study. So that's why also I'm doing this presentation, although to be honest, it's not so elaborated. My kid was also sick, and yeah, please don't be too harsh with me. Yeah, in my thesis, wait, I go to the next slide maybe, yeah. I had a closer look on one particular district in Magdeburg, which is a mid-sized city in the eastern part of Germany. There was an outbreak of COVID-19 that mostly hit Romanian citizens living under very dense conditions in this district. This district already had a long history of high media attention in regards to EU migration before, and it is also considered to be the reason for the adoption of the so-called Housing Regulatory Act in 2018 in the state where Magdeburg is situated, Saxony-Anhalt. And this law is prohibiting, among others, overcrowded housing. I was especially interested for my thesis in the question why overcrowding is actually existing in times of an ever-increasing housing stock, and how does it become a problem, if at all, and to whom? So my research question was, how is overcrowding produced in a social spatial sense as a very cramped housing, but also in a discursive and normative sense in terms of being a problem, as it is, of course, relational and socially constructed, what we call and define as overcrowding and cramped housing. I had an explorative approach and very difficult fieldwork conditions, as the research took place between October and January. So yeah, I'm lacking a broader perspective of the inhabitants. At the end, I contacted some non-participative and systematic observations in the district, led semi-structured online interviews with 2 social workers, including one woman who also migrated from Romania herself and lives in the district at the moment, with a politician who was part of the committees that worked and adopted this before mentioned law, as well as with street level bureaucrats that are responsible for the implementation of the law. Besides, I conducted media analysis of the local press and of housing regulatory acts. Due to the explorative nature of my research, my presentation is now mostly focusing on empirical findings. Like this picture, I haven't commented on it, it's from this district. And in this area, there live around 2,000 people with a Romanian and to a very lesser extent also Bulgarian citizenship, or both. And they are mostly Roma families. First people arrived in 2014. And yeah, the housing situation in Magdeburg is very diverse, actually. Like mostly they live in housing estates from GDR times, which you can see on the left on this picture. Partly it's a very bad building quality, including mold and defective electricity, but partly building quality is okay. Partly they are very high rents, partly it's average rents for the area. But what many families share is a very dense living situations in 2- and 3-room apartments. I calculated an estimated average living space per person of 12.6 square meters, and some families of 6 children and more live on estimated average space of 6 square meters per person or less. So as a comparison, the average in Germany is 46 square meters. Those cramped living situations evolved actually in a field of tension between accessibilities and inaccessibilities. So On the one hand, those blocks were accessible due to post-GDR decline and also privatization of those before communal housing, and offered space to newcomers. In the case of my interview partner, it was a good option because it was less expensive than the housing situation in Berlin, where she lived before, and the flat was mediated by her aunt. The flats in the blocks were accessible, but often in a very bad condition with profit-oriented owners and, yeah, as I said, little space. Actually, in literature, those situations of overcrowding are described also as a usual phenomenon due to the legal requirement of having an address linked to residence and social benefits. And I mentioned it before, it should be within 7 days. Yeah, but literature, it's mostly related to the unavailability of affordable housing as well, especially in cities with a tense housing market. But actually in Magdeburg, it's not such a tense housing market. Additionally, most of the EU migrants are working and receive social benefits. So it's rather the inaccessibility actually of affordable housing due to multiple discriminations as a big family, as non-German speaking people, as EU citizens, and especially as Romnia. Although cultural practices such as co-sleeping of all kids in one bed make cramped living possible, and some people argued also that the families don't have a problem to live on those cramped conditions, it is clear that it has also negative effects on mental and physical health, on the children's performance at school, especially now during Corona lockdowns, and that those spatial conditions created further stigmatization. So cramped living conditions can be seen as an expression, but also a cause for inequalities. I would now like to come to the Housing Regulatory Act that developed in several states as a reaction to EU migration. It actually offers municipalities more possibilities to intervene in case of deplorable housing conditions. Besides the material condition and equipment of a house or apartment, the law tackles the question of overcrowding. So to give a definition, housing situations with less than 9 square meters per person above the age of 6 and less of 6 square meters per child aged under 6 are prohibited. I see the Housing Regulatory Act as a very ambivalent law. Actually, it should offer cities the possibility to intervene in favor of the tenants, but on the other hand, it also offers municipalities the chance to control and also to evict people against their will. So in my research, it became clear that deplorable housing conditions were not part of the media and political discourse, apart from one assumption of a mattress camp. But instead, the law was situated in 2 discourses. One is one on quite trivial neighborhood conflicts around noise and waste. I think we all can imagine how this looks like, especially in this discursive context of poverty migration. But this also was actually linked to the living situation, because sometimes there was no waste disposal existing due to the private landlords, and also the cramped living conditions are surely resulting in a higher, let's say, pressure on the public space, which is in this area already scarcely existing. Although I know the first picture showed it differently, but this is an exception. And yeah, those neighborhood conflicts were inflated in the media. Migrants were made responsible for this. And the other discourse where the implementation of the law is situated is also well known, I think, on those supposed, in the case of Magdeburg, supposed criminal structures and the general illegitimacy of migrant stay and access to social benefits. So media and politicians suggested criminality, but it was never proven. Instead, like my interviewees said, they neglected it and portrayed it actually towards me as racist and xenophobic local politics. Criminality was understood in terms of an organization of and connection between immigration, overcrowding, and work, organized by profit-oriented criminals, but it actually included a general suspect of an illegitimate migration and stay. I would say that for the case of Magdeburg, at least, there are very blurry lines between criminal and criminalization. To sum up, overcrowding was associated with a perceived deviant behavior, causing neighborhood conflicts, as well as a suspected illegitimacy by suggesting criminal structures behind cramped housing conditions. So what became clear in my analysis is that discursively, the law was no response to bad living conditions and its roots in multiple inaccessibilities. This finding is in line with research in this topic, I guess, of poverty migration. So not the problems of the people are considered, but the people are considered the problem. But for the case of Magdeburg, there are many indices that this is not only the case for the political and media environment of its adaptation, but also for its implementation.
3 minutes left.
Okay. I tried to go through it. So contrary to other cities, it focused solely on overcrowding in Magdeburg. And my interviews described me exemplary that its implementation was also solely linked to neighborhood problems and even complaints by landlords. The controls were not only targeting the living size, but also the residency status and the legal labor situation of the controlled household. So they were used as an entry point to control people in a wider sense. Apparently overcrowded households were aimed to evict even if those wanted to stay, and there were no other, for example, building security reasons. And there were families that were displaced, and if they couldn't find another apartment due to the household size, they had to go to homeless shelters and eventually left the city. I see I could see a high chance of misuse, especially as those people were hindered to arrive and settle and also couldn't communicate their experiences though. Besides, everything was integrated in a very unreflected racial discourse by my interviewees. As a last point, it became clear that cramped living condition, may they be below, but also average, the legal definition became normalized and invisible. The city is not caring about bad or squeezed living conditions or tries to change anything. Actually, it's the opposite. Even the communal housing cooperative is discriminating Romanian households, and there was no acknowledgement of housing or other forms of discrimination. And yeah, also COVID-19 showed this again. Maybe I shouldn't go into detail, but there as well as in many other cities, the block was completely locked up and controlled by police. People were blamed for behavior, and nobody talked about the missing isolation opportunities and the threat of infection. So here as well, housing conditions actually stayed invisible. Yeah, as I tried to show in my presentation, the socio-spatial conditions of overcrowding and cramped living situations continue to produce exclusions, inequalities, and stigmatizations, also beyond the actual arrival phase. And of course, this is only one facet showing those social reproduction of inequalities in regards to EU migrants, but I wanted to shed light on it because I see many areas that need more research, your experiences, and especially more intervention. Yeah, thanks for your interest.
Thanks a lot, Miriam. Thank you for keeping the time as well. And yeah, many connections also with the previous panel where we saw this intersection of forms of discrimination. So thanks for another rich contribution. And now we are moving to Vessela Kovacheva, who is going to address approaches of inclusion and exclusion of EU migrants in need for assistance, results from an empirical study in Hamburg. So we're moving to a different part of Germany now. Vessela, if you'd like to start the presentation, as usual, I will keep the time.
Thank you very much. I will just start my presentation. Okay. Thank you for giving me the chance to be here today and to discuss with you some results from Hamburg. I'm Vessela Kovacheva. I'm a migration researcher currently based at the Center for Migration Research and Integration Practice at the Hamburg University of Applied Sciences. I hold PhD in political sciences and from the University of Münster. And I wrote my PhD on the topic of the impact of EU accession on Bulgarian migration to Germany. I looked at changes in migration and integration patterns and carried out a survey among 400 Bulgarian migrants in Hamburg, looking at their integration in different living areas such as labor market, but also political participation and naturalization practices. My PhD was published this year, but today I'm not going to present results from the PhD thesis, but some results from empirical study here, again in the city of Hamburg. And the focus of the study are EU migrants in precarious living situations who are in the need of for support. I will very briefly introduce the project and then focus on some results on the situation of EU migrants in the city of Hamburg, and then on policies of inclusion and exclusion and how what empirical evidence we found at the local level of these national and local policies on the situation of EU migrants. Just to give you an idea about the frame of this project, it's not a classical research project. It is applied project commissioned by the Diakonie. This is the Protestant charity organization in Germany. And the main aim was to explore the situation of EU migrants from the three main sending countries, Bulgaria, Romania, and Poland, and in particular to have a focus on people who are in precarious living situations, in precarious housing or working conditions, such as homeless people, undocumented workers, but also precarious workers, EU migrants without health insurance, and also without access to medical care. We started in 2019 and have already published some results from this study, and what I'm going to present is still work in progress. What we have done, we analyzed many documents, but also conducted statistical analysis in order to give an overview of the situation of these three groups, not only in Germany, but also in Hamburg. And we carried out problem-centered interview with 10 key stakeholders these are experts in the field of EU migration here in Hamburg. And then we carried out also interviews, semi-structured interviews with 30 EU migrants from the three main sending countries. So just to give you an idea about migration from Bulgaria, Romania, and Poland, I would like to show this figure presenting migration, the number or the population of Bulgarian, Romanian, and Polish nationality in Hamburg from 2004 until now. So we can see a very sharp increase of the registered population from about 20,000 people to more than 50,000 people. And correspondingly, also the share of these three nationalities increased from 8% to 16% of the foreign population in the city. I see, I have here my figure in German. I'm very sorry for that. So we Hamburg experienced a sharp increase of these three nationalities, and most of them do fare very well and integrate very well in the German society. They have regular jobs, they have social security, health insurance, access to medical care, and are almost invisible for the German society. And this is also statistical indicators such as labor market statistics show a clear trend of improving labor market participation of the three nationalities after the end of the transitional periods, limiting the free movement of work since 2014. So we have increasing employment, decreasing unemployment, and decreasing dependence on the welfare system. So we see that the vast majority of the three nationalities are very well established in the German society in Hamburg. Nevertheless, there are many indicators that these three nationalities are particularly affected by homelessness and precarious work, and these are the most severe problems we identified at local level. So what we have heard about Magdeburg is applicable also to Hamburg. It's difficult to quantify how many EU migrants are in a precarious living situation. And we have some indication, for instance, about the number of EU migrants who are homeless, living on the street. There was a survey commissioned by the city of Hamburg in 2019, and it clearly showed that Bulgarians, Romanians, and Polish, they are disproportionately high affected by homelessness compared to their share in the foreign population. Just an example, just two numbers, when we have Polish migration, Polish migrants as an example, we have 15% of all homeless people in Hamburg are of Polish nationality, compared to only 9%, 8% of Polish migrants in the total foreign population in Hamburg. So again, they are disproportionately affected by this problematic. Well, the numbers are very low compared, given or in relation to the whole number of these populations of these three nationalities. So the numbers are really low, but these are groups with a need of support, of great support. And the main aim of our study was to analyze, as I said, first the situation of these groups, and then of the three nationalities, and then to identify needs for support, to analyze existing needs for support, but also to identify measures and policies which are needed in order to improve the situation of these very vulnerable groups, as I said, particularly homeless people, but also people in insecure housing situations as overcrowding, but also people who are undeclared workers or not so socially secured. Based on our interviews with experts in particular, and also on document analysis, we identified approaches and policies at both local and national levels that affect severely, affects hardly the EU migrants. In particular, the two local approaches in Hamburg. Since the beginning of 2010, we observe an increasing low threshold support services for EU citizens, in particular for homeless people. There are many consulting services for this group. The capacities in the so-called winter program this is an accommodation program for homeless people. The capacities have been also increased continuously. But despite of these improvements or a very inclusive policy towards EU nationals, we observe also some exclusive policies and approaches at the local level, in particular with regards to homeless EU migrants. This is the systematic assessment of the prospects of homeless people in the accommodation program in the winter months. And there is a trend of a return policy of EU citizens whose prospects are considered or assessed by social workers as low. So people who don't have chances to find a regular job in the labor market, they are advised or prepared to return to their countries of origin. And this is a practice, a local practice that is very systematic since 2016. And apart from this mixture of inclusive and exclusive approaches at the local level, I would like to mention two very important law amendments or federal laws that impact on the situation of EU nationals in Germany, but in particular in Hamburg, because of the, again, very systematic implementation of these national policies at the national level. So this both policies are rather exclusive and limit the rights of EU nationals. The first one is, I think, very popular. This is the federal law as of 2016, and it limited the access to welfare benefits in the first 5 years of residence for a particular group of EU nationals. These are job seekers and inactive EU citizens. This means that they are now legally excluded from social rights in the first 5 years. And the second law amendment, it's not very popular, but it's very has a very strong effect on the communities. And this is the again, as I said, federal law. There is a reporting obligation of the labor administration to the immigration authorities in case of application for welfare benefits. It means when EU nationals apply for welfare benefits, for social assistance, for instance, their data, their personal data is reported to immigration authorities, and the immigration authorities verify whether EU migrants meet the conditions to stay. So they verify systematically the right of residence, which is actually in contradiction to the current EU law in force. And what we found empirical evidence on the effects or on the implications of these difficult local and national approaches or practices towards EU migrants. There are some very positive effects. As I said, the support measures for EU citizens that are currently in precarious living situations have
about 3 minutes left.
Yes, thank you, have expanded in the last years. So they are much more counseling services for EU migrants, and they are very frequently used. There is also a local practice of providing so-called postal addresses for persons who are not registered, and this is experienced as a very great advantage for non-registered people in order to take up regular employment, in order to stabilize their situation, living situation in the receiving country. Nevertheless, particularly for the group of homeless people, these measures improve only temporarily the situation. Most of them remain in the so-called low threshold help system. So it's difficult to get out of the situation of homelessness and to take up regular employment and to receive social welfare benefits. And a second very dramatic effect on the situation of EU citizens in general, not only, we're talking about not only persons in precarity, but also but EU citizens in general, this is that there is an increasing legal uncertainty in terms of residence and social rights. Many EU migrants are reluctant to apply for welfare benefits, and even if they are eligible for them, the practical access is very, very difficult, and in many cases impossible without the support of charity organizations. And the second, with regard to residence rights, as I already mentioned, this is the policy of reporting from the labor administration to the immigration office, these practices, which are really very extensively used here in Hamburg, they increase the legal uncertainty of EU citizens even after 5 years of residence in Germany. And we, as I said, we documented many cases, experiences of EU nationals here at the local level. And we are going to publish a paper, a discussion paper with some results on that. To sum up, it's quite a big topic. I'm not able to present all the results we have in the project, but so the main point is we identified, we explored and the situation of EU migrants from the 3 countries in Hamburg and found that they successfully integrate in the German society, and only a minor group of people is in need for support. National and local policies of exclusion exacerbate the situation of migrants in precarious living situations in Hamburg, but also in Germany. And we recommend more preventive policies of inclusion, in particular, supporting the access to housing and employment for job seekers at the very beginning phase of immigration to Germany. So this is, these are some insights from Hamburg, and I would like to discuss with you policies of inclusion and exclusion of EU migrants also in other German cities, but also EU member states. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Vessela. Really, really rich presentation, excellent work. So I'm gonna move now to the discussion. As usual, please feel free to raise your hand. I will look at the list on the right. And just let me say, as a chair, if I can use the time, I was really impressed by how all the papers talk to each other. I think this relationship between migration and welfare controls as a way to reproduce a kind of vulnerable workforce was quite obvious from all of them. And perhaps this is maybe a later question for Mark as well, whether he sees this also as a way to actually respond to the crisis of care and social reproduction more broadly. I was particularly struck also by the Bulgarian case by Jana, when she mentioned the fact that people who move a lot between places actually don't claim social benefits at all. So again, this is a way for the state to save the cost of social reproduction of the workforce, and the relation to mobility is very interesting there. But yeah, thank you very much, everyone, for fantastic, rich research shared here. Anyone would like to ask questions? Katalin, please, Katalin.
Hello, everybody. Thank you. I'm Katalin Buzoianu. I'm writing my PhD in sociology in Berlin now on the role of social counselors and their work with Romanian migrants here in Berlin. And I also worked as a social counselor for 2 years. So I kind of transformed my former job into a PhD project. I would like to thank, first of all, the speakers for the very thought-provoking lectures, and I have 2 questions, one for Miriam and one for Vessela, because I see a lot of empirical overlays with it between our different research fields. My question for Miriam would be, you mentioned quite briefly, because probably of the time, of conflicts between the majority population in the neighborhoods in Magdeburg and the migrants. Because I'm working on exactly these kind of local non-governmental projects or organizations, my question would be, have you observed in your field kind of like this non-governmental or private public type of relationships when it comes to these kind of, we call them in Berlin, Problemimmobilien, so like problem buildings where you have like overcrowding and stuff. And this is of course like a political term, problems. Have you seen something like cooperation in order to manage or contain these conflicts when the escalation reaches a level where it's very difficult to live in the neighborhood? Because quite surely in Berlin, at a local level, there has been some kind of cooperative containment, let's say, policies. And my second question to Vessela, I was curious to see. It's something like a counter question to your question at the end, and I hope I'm not so. Eine Minute bitte. I'm not. I'm sorry, I have workers in the house. I'm just asking, what would be the idea of inclusion behind this policies of inclusion? I mean, what's the end goal of this inclusion? What's the model of inclusion? Because usually when we talk about inclusion in this context, it seems to me at least to be a blurry concept. Does inclusion mean that they don't need to access social welfare benefits, or that they're not standing out? So that was my two questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Katalin. Miriam is actually the next in the list to ask a question, but maybe you also want to answer directly, please.
Yes, I would reply, and then I can ask my question directly to Vessela, who will be next anyway. Yeah, actually, I mean, those conflicts that they were described to me and from media as very trivial, actually, around noise and waste, etc. But it was really inflated in the media, so they were really, really present, and it got the stigma of a hotspot or ghetto. So the politics reacted after a while, and they made some round tables together with the inhabitants, but not so much participation of the Romanian communities. And actually their reaction was very much directed towards law and order. So they set up an extra office of the order department in this district, but there was a whole process of round tables and people could bring their concerns. And yeah, also the NGO I talked to, they are funded, I think, by municipal and state money, but their funding is renewed every year. So it's kind of a precarious funding situation. If this answers to your question a bit. Otherwise, you can contact me and we can talk about it more detailed. And my question to Vessela is about this postal address offer. I didn't quite get it. Maybe I was inattentive, but maybe you can talk about it again, from whom it was initiated. Thank you.
Thank you, Miriam. Very clear, straightforward question. We have Thorsten next.
Yeah, thank you for your presentation. They've been great. My name is Thorsten. I'm working at the University Duisburg-Essen, and my research is very similar to what Miriam and what Vessela presented. And we're looking here at local landscapes, and we can see this. How integration offices, labor market offices, housing policies, migration offices, how they work together to deal with what is called poverty migration and so on. And for me, I think there is, for me, this looking at these localities is producing something like a picture what is not only local, because this strange interaction between talking about integration policies and supporting migrants, producing inclusion or integration or whatever, and at the same time making very exclusive and implementing very exclusive policies. This is what we can see in all of these different localities, I would say. I have one question, especially to Vessela. One of the most interesting and most mysterious organizations I've been talking with are the migration offices. And these migration offices, they withdraw the right to stay or the freedom of movement. Do you know more about the praxis of these withdrawals? Because I have never ever until today found numbers how often this happens. I'm quite sure that, for example, labor market administration and immigration offices, somehow they work together. You also said it. Maybe, I don't know. I really don't know. Because labor market integration, I've got interviews, they say the migration office, they are too slow in producing these withdrawals. And then after 5 years, we have to pay for the people. So I don't know in which or how they work together and how they exchange information or something like this. That would be very curious if you know more about this withdrawal, this praxis of withdrawal, and the numbers of withdrawals, because this is the most or this is a very hard measure to make people to set people in a position how they are not able or how they cannot afford to lose their work. Yeah, this is what this is.
Thank you. Very important question. I have Lisa and then Paulina, and then we will move back to the panelists. Lisa Riedner.
Yeah, I'm trying to make it short. First, maybe I want to add to Thorsten's questions. Also, it's not only about withdrawals. I think it's also about deportations. So I would like also to know what you research, if you have research results, or if you know anything about numbers of numbers, or like about the whole topic of deportation of EU citizens. And something that I was I'm thinking about, or longer, but already for here, I think it combines the first and the second panel in a way, is about why do we talk about, when like who is a migrant in the end. So why do we talk about, or when do we talk about EU mobility, and when do we talk about EU migration, and what effects does this migrantization have? Because as we all know, migration has to be put at the concept of migration, like it has to be produced. So it's the production of migration is part also of this of this conjuncture of racism within Europe and also outside. And then I had to start, because I already, when we organized this conference, we noticed that there is a big blind spot. We don't have any contributions so far on anti-Roma racism. And as you noticed, we like many presentations touched this topic. But then I had to start that maybe, at least as I found this in Munich as well, and in Frankfurt and other places where I did research, somehow being a Roma, you're not a migrant, because Romnia are mobile anyway. So in a way, if we talk about migration, we racialize mobile populations, and we also point at inequalities and exclusionary mechanisms and the production of migration within policy-making processes and discourses. Of course, I'm not against using the concept of migration, because I think we also need it, but I think we should be very careful with that. But how does the category of Romnia and the category of migrants kind of intersect? And I think there's something interesting in this dynamics. I don't know if this was a question or if it was just a comment. I think it was more a comment, but the deportation question, the question was about deportation as well.
Thank you, Lisa. And finally, Paulina.
Yeah, thank you. So my question is more to Jana. So I'm wondering, in terms of transnationalism as an analytical framework, and as of how much it actually reflects the current debates in the transnationalist scholarship, how do they reflect this reality of intra-EU migration that are becoming more and more transnationalized, and this really accelerated movements between here and there, and more than just sending and receiving localities. Because it seems to me, at least my experience with this literature was that it's still very much focused in this Northwestern settler societies, and already presupposes some sort of sedentarism or settlement and stability within the settler society. And then it appears as a very positive discourse where migrants are trying to navigate certain difficulties in their settlement pathways through resorting to these transnational strategies. But here, actually, in this specific case of East-West migration, it seems that we also need to talk about this cracks in social protection that you were talking about, and we need to more talk about dislocation or accelerated exploitation or increasing dependency when we talk about, when we use a transnationalist prism. So basically, how is this entanglement between these coercive systems and this inability to achieve any sort of stability and desired permanence are playing out in these transnational practices in this specific case, and whether do we have the tools to actually talk about this within this transnationalist framework?
Wow, what a question, Paulina. Really good. So shall we move back to the panelists? I feel like maybe we'll start with Vessela and then move to Jana and then Mark, and then finally Miriam, if you still have some points to raise.
Thank you very much for these great questions. I will start with a question of Miriam about postal addresses. And what are postal addresses? So you know, all people in Germany, migrants and non-migrants, are obliged to register with the local administration to be registered as a citizen in the locality. And many EU migrants who are homeless or who are living in a flat of a friend or a family, they don't have the possibility to register. And without the registration, this official letter of confirmation of your residence in Germany, you are not able to take up regular employment. And some years ago, I think in the early 2010, in Hamburg, the charity organizations, the welfare organizations started providing so-called postal addresses for non-registered migrants in Hamburg. These, you can imagine, these are just postal addresses in order to receive some briefs from local authorities, and this give you the opportunity to take up regular employment. And this is we found really empirical evidence that these postal address give the opportunity to many migrants, EU migrants, to settle in Hamburg and to start first by finding this regular employment and then finding a regular housing accommodation. And there are also some discussions now at the local level that these postal addresses should be maybe financed by the local authorities, because it's the capacities are not enough for the needs of EU migrants. I hope I answered your question. Then I move to the question about deportations, about the role of immigration offices. It's quite difficult to get insight into the work of the immigration offices in Germany. We tried to conduct an interview with representatives of the immigration office here in Hamburg, and we weren't successful, unfortunately. We conducted only interviews with the representatives of the labor administration and the social administration. There are indeed some data on the numbers of people, of EU migrants whose right of residence was, who lost their right of residence after the immigration office checked, verified whether the person meet the conditions to stay. And just an example how immigration offices proceed during in the 2016 and 17, this was the very beginning of this systematic verification of the right of residence of homeless people here in Hamburg. The representatives of the immigration officers went to the streets, to the homeless people on the streets, and invited them to go to the immigration office, and in order to check their right of residence. And in this very first wave, I would say, many homeless EU migrants were obliged to leave the country. But we know EU legal framework allows that EU migrants come back very quickly after they left the country. So there's this is a very highly contested debate here at the local level about the implementation of this policy, of the meaning and of the impact of this policy. And there are some data, as I said, and this is in the Drucksachen, the government papers that which are published monthly. So there are some indications in the statistics about the number of EU migrants who have lost their right of residence, and they are published yearly. So we have some numbers about 2016, 17, and so on. The numbers are not very, I'm not quite sure, I have to check this again, about 300 persons annually. In these government papers, it's also stated that the number of people, of EU migrants who are deported is very low, or no deportations of EU migrants have been documented. And it's, I think they corrected the local practice. At the very beginning, they really deported some homeless people, but then they stopped practicing these deportations here at the local level. Because again, this was very often in contradiction to the current EU legal framework. As I said, you can check die Drucksachen der hamburgischen Bürgerschaft on the topic.
If you can wrap up, Vessela, we are running out of time, thanks.
Okay, just very briefly, the idea of inclusion and the concept of inclusion, I think it's a very big question, and for time constraints, I would say that we distinguish between legal inclusion and inclusion in the through the regulatory framework. And of course, there are some constraints there when the law, it's more difficult to change the law, and law changes take much more time. But we argue in this project that some local measures and practices are needed irrespective of the current legal framework for EU citizens, and needed to support the initial process of settlement of EU migrants at the local level, in particular job seekers, giving them accommodation and also supporting their job searching strategies. Okay, thank you.
That's very good. Thank you so much, Vessela. So I don't know, Jana, would you like to add something, Mark?
Paulina has asked me a question about transnationality. I don't think we have the tools, really. We can have this transnational lens, and since Nina Glick-Schiller wrote about the multiplicity of migrants' involvements in both home and host society, there's actually this view that leave us with this approach. So when I did my research, I focused really on the way migrants constitute their mobility projects, and I did not work with this transnational concept only because yes, it gives me also only the lens of this to see in this how migrants are in both countries at the same time. you can see many examples in the literature. So yes, so I looked at the different agency concepts.
That's great. Thank you, Jana. Mark, Miriam, would you like to add anything? Any reflections on the bigger questions?
There's a lot of big questions, but too little time. So I don't want to steal people's lunch break.
Exactly. So maybe thank you. Sometime maybe we can just return to some of the bigger questions, like the relation with the crisis of social reproduction and the bigger question that Lisa also put in front of us about the importance to still critically reflect on mobility, migration, and then we saw also emigration in the previous session. So thank you everyone so much. Extremely thought-provoking session. I will see you all at 15 past 2. Have a good lunch break.